It is sometimes said that it takes all sorts to make a world. I remember attending a talk once in which the speaker spoke of the campaigner type of personality and contrasted it with the civil servant type. The campaigner type, on this understanding, tends to see things in fairly clear-cut terms, perhaps at the expense of subtlety, but with the possible advantage of a greater likelihood of a certain prophetic force and clarity. The civil servant type, by contrast, tends to appreciate the spectrum of possible perspectives, is alive to the moral and practical ambiguities, and tends to seek consensus. Good qualities all, though with the greater risk of a misplaced acquiescence. There can be strengths and weaknesses to the different types of temperament and perspective. Sometimes the very qualities that enable a person to make great contributions in one context are the very same qualities that cause them to blunder in other situations. Indeed, it is not a mere accident that many political careers end in failure, if only for the simple reason that very few human beings manage to be ideal for the wide diversity of situations that can arise. And it is not by accident that many important decisions are entrusted to committees, which, if suitably balanced and well run, can seek to harness the advantages of the different types of temperaments and perspectives, and thus insights to be found among us. When it comes to St. John the Baptist, what is sometimes overlooked, at least in popular imagination, is how tremendously complicated were the times in which he lived. He was, after all, living in a land unjustly occupied by a foreign power, the Romans. History teaches us again and again that when a country is unjustly occupied, all sorts of difficult moral complexities arise, even if there are many other matters that are morally and practically straightforward. Thus, to give a modern example, a civil servant in an occupied land might seek not to prop up the occupying power, but they also need to do their best to keep the schools and hospitals open, keep the water flowing and the electricity supply going, which benefits the general population and the unjust regime alike. Then there are the ways in which extra slippery slopes can arise, especially when a society gets badly damaged and corrupted. If I can bend the rules here, and isn't pretty much everything corrupt anyway, then what stops me from doing the same and again and again? And then there are the invidious ways in which interpersonal trust gets undermined in such societies. A civil servant does their job diligently in a time of occupying power, but are they really one of them or one of us? Their actions could be taken either way. It is in such tricky general circumstances that the people come to John the Baptist to ask him, "What then shall we do?" It is to their credit that they do not go to a lax casuistic type, or to even the more upstanding person who reliably dives headlong into the complexities and perhaps gets a bit lost in them. They go to someone who probably best fits the campaigner type of personality about which I spoke earlier, and the kind of person not giving to mincing their words or equivocating or giving easy get-outs. But all the same, notice the subtle appreciation of the situation in John's words. He answered them, "Whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise." In a society in which interpersonal trust is corroded, and perhaps pretty much everyone is watching their own back, here John is telling his listeners to go against the current, to reach out to others in ways that can forge afresh the networks of trust, cooperation, and solidarity. Then there are those who work in the various institutions at the coalface of interaction, and thus cooperation, possibly collusion, you could say, with the unjust forces of occupation. Thus, John tells the tax collectors who wish to be baptized by him that they are to collect no more than they are authorized to do. Put like that, it could come across as rather woolly, something John the Baptist is rarely, if ever, accused of. After all, it's not only a matter of what is authorized, but by whom. What would be authorized by God and what would be authorized by a corrupt power might be very different indeed. Interestingly, though, scholars also point out that deeply corrupt though the Roman system was in practice, Caesar Augustus did try to stamp out the abuses. Even if corrupt practices were tolerated on the ground, the tax collectors knew what they ought not to do, as befits those tax collectors who came to John seeking what was, after all, a baptism of repentance. These are people who had their moral compasses on. The soldiers receive a similar kind of message. In a society corrupted by unjust occupation, in which the opportunities for exploitative collusion were rife, John tells his listeners to never give way to the powerful, corrupting forces about them. But notice what is going on here. Elsewhere in the Gospels, John the Baptist is very forthright and forceful indeed, very black and white, you could say, even radical and subversive. Yet here in today's Gospel reading, we see an aspect of this truly great saint of enormous importance that is often overlooked, namely that John had a keen appreciation of the complexities too. We should share what we can, and tax collectors and soldiers are never to act in certain ways. But for all that, John does not tell the tax collectors or the soldiers to rebel or to resort to the covert acts of subversion that their roles might have enabled them to perform. Like the civil servant in difficult circumstances who needs to keep the schools and hospitals open, so too even the tax collectors and soldiers can, if they conduct themselves righteously, manage to be a force for at least some good, even if it's far from perfect. There is therefore, I suggest, more of the civil servant type, as per my earlier categorization, in John the Baptist than he is generally given credit for. For John the Baptist is an exemplar of the voice of selfless integrity and truthfulness in a highly compromised world. It is a mark of his integrity and truthful insight that he knows when to allow the prophetic voice its full force and when to allow the subtleties in. It ought never be a matter of mere personal preference, and we should all try to overcome, or at least be aware of, the limitations and blind spots that all of us, you and me, with our individual temperaments, are prone to. Ideally, it should be the nature of the circumstances themselves that determine what is said and done. And being true to what the circumstances themselves tell us, regardless of individual taste and tendency, that is a mark of personal integrity, self-knowledge, and truthfulness. There are occasions for subtleties, and there are occasions for clear right and wrong. But there ought never be an occasion for allowing oneself open to becoming corrupted, or sliding into becoming conformed to the world in the sense of the world standing for what is contrary to goodness and truth, and thus to the will of God and the path of true human flourishing. All times and ages will have their moral and spiritual traps, and strengths too. John the Baptist's example from a very different time can still be an inspiration and guide to us living in the here and now, with so many subtleties and ambiguities as all times have had, and so much too that in the end of the day is fairly straightforwardly right or wrong.